we're really excited to be presenting this program today. So once again, my name is Joy. I'm the Public Program Supervisor at JANM. And this is inspired by Miné, a program that is really near and dear to my heart. And I'm so excited that we're able to gather these folks today. I'm a big fan of all of their work. And I think that we're in for a real treat and exciting conversation today. I want to begin by introducing our moderator, Rose Keiko Higa, who came to JANM as a Getty Marrow curatorial intern in the summer of 2021, where she worked with curator Kristen Hayashi on this exhibition, Miné Okubo's masterpiece. And really, this exhibition would not have been possible without Rose Keiko's work. So I'm so excited that she's the one that's going to be guiding us through this conversation today. She's a junior at Oberlin College in Ohio and is majoring in art history with a minor in East Asian studies and book studies. So I think the perfect person to be guiding us through this conversation today. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Rose Keiko. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joy, for having me. This is really wonderful to be here and to be in a conversation with such amazing artists. Miné Okubo is such a prolific artist herself, both in her chronicling of her experience at camp, but also in her post-war work. And JANM is really lucky to have received a lot of that in donation from her foundation. So introducing our wonderful artists for today, we have Kiku Hughes, who is a Yonsei cartoonist based in the Seattle area. Her first graphic novel, Displacement, was published by First Second in 2020. Her work, published by Nickelodeon Dark Horse, Shortbox, Beyond Anthologies, and more, explores themes of identity, queer romance, soft sci-fi, and anti-capitalist futures. Our next artist is MariNaomi, who is the author and illustrator of multiple graphic novels and memoirs and a book of erotic fruit and veggies. She has had work featured in the Smithsonian, Cartoon Art Museum, and the New Yorker. And last but not least, Yumi Sakugawa is a second-generation Japanese Okinawan American interdisciplinary artist and the author of several published books. She has also been published in the New Yorker, Bitch, BuzzFeed, and Best American Non-Required Reading 2014, Dum Dum Zine, and other publications, and has exhibited multimedia works at JANM, the Peabody Essex Museum, and the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building. So we're so lucky to have you all here today. Thank you for taking the time out of your Saturday. So my first question for you all is what your relation to Miné Okubo is and how she may have influenced your artistic practice.
Yeah, I'll start. My first book and really my first foray into long form comics, Displacement, was a story of exploring sort of what I didn't know about my family's time in Japanese American incarceration camps. I was, looking for resources that were really reflective of the Japanese American experience itself and not what the WRA and what the government sort of recorded. And Miné's book, obviously, Citizen 13660, was one of the most valuable tools at my disposal for figuring out, the real lived experiences of people in camp, and specifically in the same exact camps that my grandmother was in Tanforan and Topaz. What I was really it was very meaningful to me to have this resource from a Japanese American woman specifically, who, shared her experiences in such an authentic and raw way. It was just finding her work and understanding, what it took for her to record all of this and to really be honest about her feelings and to publish it so soon after the camps closed. The kind of bravery that took and the importance of art that it really demonstrated was really meaningful to me in my process.
I'll go next. To be honest, this is the first time I've read anything or been exposed to anything by her. I heard about this book for years, and I was kind of, I didn't go searching for it because everything about incarceration camps makes me cry. And sometimes you're in a mood for a cry, but I was never in the mood for that kind of cry, especially since a lot of my family were incarcerated, and it just, it was just too personal. My first trip to Janum actually was it was a Hapa exhibit, and they also had Japanese incarceration camp, like an exhibit for that. And I had to leave because it was just too overwhelming. Like, first of all, that I saw all these Hapas there, I was like, oh my God, there's so many of us. And also just to be exposed to just this horror that I've been avoiding my whole life was just, it was too much. And I was in tears, and I was leaving, like good tears and bad tears. So yeah, that's why I'd avoided it for so long. And so when I picked up this book, this book is freaking amazing. It was really hard for me to get through, just emotionally. It was like each page, like after every couple pages, I had to put it down. And I was really struck by, this is a graphic memoir, and I'd been told that the first graphic memoir was done in the 70s by a white man, and hello, that is not the case. And it just, so like clearly we were all influenced by this. Anyone who's done autobiographical comics or any comics really, but yeah, I have a lot of feelings, and I feel like I'm going to be influenced by this more, because of this. But yeah, I was influenced indirectly, but also there's so much more to come.
I'll go next. Yeah, I think similar to MariNaomi, I didn't encounter Miné Okubo's work until very recently, though similar to Mari, I've heard about her for years, and I didn't hear about her until probably over 5 years ago, when I just happened to come across a Twitter thread of two fellow Japanese American cartoonists just talk about her work and just talk about, it's so offensive that more people don't know about her, and many people have to sort of stumble upon it in this like esoteric way, instead of having it readily available in a canonical way among other historical classics that were sort of taught through school or through collective culture. And I think just opening the page, I immediately connected. Miné, who's an artist, who's living the artist life, and her life is suddenly disrupted by historical events beyond her control. And I think I'm still recollecting myself and still integrating and processing what it means to encounter her work and how it's going to impact me to come. But I think the immediate thing that came to mind is how radical and subversive it was for her, a Japanese American woman, to chronicle her life and to have her narrative be centered, and how even now today that is still radical and subversive. An Asian American woman speaking her truth and telling her story. And I think it just brings inspiration to me, as I'm sure it does to many other Asian American women and femme artists, just how important it is to share our stories, no matter how mundane it is. It is just such a groundbreaking thing to do, to give ourselves a platform to share whatever it is that's going on in our lives.
Thank you. Those are really amazing responses. So yeah, Miné Okubo was really an amazing artist and author, and used her time incarcerated in Tanfran and Topaz to chronicle her experience as a Japanese American and as a Japanese American woman. Before the war, she was pursuing her master's degree in Europe in art, and then had to come back because of the death of her mother. and was really thrown into World War II. It all happened really fast. And so my next question for you is how you all feel as illustrators, as cartoonists, as comic artists, how that medium helps to foster self-reflection. You've all done work with that medium and also have made work that is reflective of your Japanese American identity.
I could go first. I think the thing that immediately comes to mind, which I think you fellow cartoonists can relate to, is that cartooning is so slow. It is such a time-consuming process. So I think because of the very slow nature of writing and drawing, and more often than not, planning and outlining and storyboarding, penciling, inking, editing, et cetera, I think just by the very nature of the slowness of the process, I think it just makes it a much more reflective and conscious process, because I think because of the nature of how time consuming it could be, I think you then become very intentional and conscious of what are the details that you're putting in, what are the things that you're putting, leaving out, what are the things that get filtered through your decision making, and what is distilled on the page that is the most important and integral to you. And so I think there's just a lot of decision making and what is the most important thing to you, even if other people may think it's mundane or silly or inconsequential. And I found that in reading Miné's works, I really loved the very mundane details. And I think in going through her book, it just really slowed down the day-to-day of life in camp in a way that I've never, I think, experienced before. And as a Japanese American person, I did encounter history of the camp through many mediums, many ways, whether it was documentary or actually visiting Manzanar or listening to oral history. And they're all obviously certainly very vital in their own way. And I think with the graphic memoir format, I think just sort of the sequential page by page and the very personal nature of the drawings and the writing, I think it just really created this really poetic, slowed down process where I really did feel the details and the minutia and the day-to-day in a really vivid way, in a way that I haven't encountered before. And so I think with cartooning, again, it's just that slowing down, the distilling of really specific details that stand out in a way that I think reading a history book or reading a Wikipedia article is not going to do justice in the same way.
I'll go next. For me personally, I didn't even consider doing any kind of memoir until I encountered comics, specifically by punk rock women in the 90s. And up to that point, I'd been writing for years and years and years. I always wanted to be a fiction author and a novelist, and that didn't really go anywhere for me because by age 21, I wasn't a bestseller. So, might as well give up. And that's about age 22 is when I encountered the comics, and I loved them so much. I couldn't believe what it was so brilliant to read the day-to-day or the exciting interpersonal stories of women in these kind of alternative lifestyles, by lesbian women, like that just wasn't available to me in literature. I hadn't found it at that point, aside from some Rita Mae Brown that I read again and again. But it wasn't really a thing to write memoir like long form prose memoir at that time. Like the only people who did memoir were celebrities. And so to encounter, just average people writing about their lives, like I was transfixed. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. And of course, anything that I love so much, I'm going to try to do myself. Sometimes I'll be more successful than others, but like the comics, it just, it felt really natural to do. And they're the only ways that I've really thought even of telling my own story is through comics. Like there are, of course, many mediums in which to do so, but for me personally, that's the one that felt the most natural. So I would love to be a musician or, to tell my story in other ways, but I don't have those skills.
Yeah. God, there's so much to say about Miné's work, because from a purely logistical stance, one of the things that makes her work so important, especially Citizen 13660, is the fact that people who are incarcerated, Japanese Americans incarcerated in these camps, weren't allowed to bring cameras with them. And for at least the first 4 years, I believe, the only photographs that exist are ones that were taken by official government photographers. And they were extremely staged. And, there was an effort to really show that this was like a happy place, that people were satisfied with their place. They had a good place to live. Everyone was happy. There was, even just in the last 10 years, there have been declassified photos that were not allowed to be viewed by the public, of guns, of barbed wire, things that were censored by the government, specifically to create a historical record that would pacify and sanitize what happened. And so Miné's work, and the work of a lot of illustrators and artists in camp at the time, created a physical record of what their conditions were in a way that the government did not want to have happen. And that power, the power of illustrating your lived experience when there's no other physical record, is so huge. And when I was working on displacement, there are times, I think any comic artist can relate, when you're sort of halfway through the project where you're like, this is nothing. There's no point to this. I should just give up. And reflecting on the way that art is actually meaningful and impactful, especially Miné's work. That was like one of the only real records we have of the real lived experiences of people. It was so motivating to me. And, the fact that it's comics, the fact that this story was sort of first told in comic form, it was a huge revelation to me. And I also found later a book that I'm going to put in the chat because I think it's really interesting. It was called Children of Topaz, and it is an illustrated diary kept by a kindergarten class in Topaz. So it wasn't published, I think, until much later, but it was made at the same time. And it is also a comic. It is a comic that children made and collaborated on, and a comic of their lived experience in Topaz. And it is a fascinating read. I highly recommend. But yeah, I think it really shows that comics are kind of a way that we've been telling our stories since we were kids a lot of times. And it's a way to really condense our experiences into, like Yumi was saying, sort of the most essential elements and the raw emotion and the things that we're feeling, not necessarily what is being seen in a photograph. Because also, I mean, even if it wasn't just the government censorship, I think we know, especially a lot of the Issei, we're probably not showing their real emotions in photographs. So Miné's work really, she shows the emotion on people's faces that they may not have expressed outwardly, but that she was feeling inwardly and knew that other people were feeling too.
Kiku, I'm curious. So I don't know if you have the version that has an introduction by Christine Hong. Talks about how this book was originally published by the WRA, which made people wonder how truthful she was being in it. And I was very, it made me wonder. And when you said that there's book about the kids, like where the kids drew it, like, did you notice any stark differences between how the kids describe their experience and how she describes hers?
You know, the main difference, I think, is that the kids actually had a moderator in their, like an external moderator, not the WRA, but their kindergarten teacher, who I believe, and I don't want to say this for sure until I get a confirmation, but I believe she was also Nikkei and was very careful to write down things that would not get her children in trouble. But the editor of the book actually did a really good job of sort of pointing out those moments where, specifically after things like the shooting of James Wakasa, the kids reflect on it, and the teacher very pointedly sort of doesn't call it a shooting necessarily, but a death, and sort of tries to create a safe space for her students, basically. And it is fascinating in that way to see the way that the teacher consciously edited what was written down based on what her students were saying.
Yeah, wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have a question in the chat for MariNaomi from Catherine, who wants to know, what was the comic artist who inspired you at age 22?
Her name's Mary Fleener, specifically. Well, there were a number of comic artists who sort of bubbled up the inspiration, but there was one comic in particular, and it was in this anthology called Twisted Sisters, a collection of bad girl art, and it was all this punk rock, these artists telling their stories. I think most, if not all, was autobiographical. And Mary Fleener had a story called The Jelly, which was about her roommate, who was just a complete hot mess. And I was howling. The story stands up. I'm more than double the age now, and I could still read it and just start laughing. But when I read it, I thought, I can draw kind of, and I have so many stories like this that I love to tell. Like, maybe I should tell my stories. And I just started doing it. And I didn't think I would get published. And I didn't think, I certainly never thought it would become more than a hobby. So, but it just made me want to make art. And I highly recommend that whole anthology, Twisted Sisters. Yeah, it was good.
So my next question for you is, if or how your Japanese American identity shows up in your work, whether or not your artwork is intending to be explicitly Japanese themed or not. I think in Miné Okubo's Citizen 13660, there is a lot of discussion around her identity specifically as a Japanese American, but as someone who the American part is very important, especially with the comparison between Issei and Nisei. So yeah, I'm very interested to hear about how you perceive your artwork in those themes.
I'll unmute. I like when I'm doing my autobiographical stuff, I just write my experience. The more I started getting published, the more I realized that people kind of wanted me to edit out my race because it was not very, what was the word, universal or relatable to whatever audience they had in mind. But this is also back in the day when there was this big hullabaloo about women don't read comics. It's all white men. So they're clearly wrong. And then there was a shift fairly recently, although I guess it depends on how old you are. But to me, it feels like yesterday, where suddenly everyone, that's all they wanted was me to write about race. And at first, I'm like, yes, finally. And it was like, blah, and I got it all out. And then after a while, I'm like, okay, I can write about other things now. So, if it were just up to me, I would just, it would just be one factor, not all the factors. But, that's the thing about commissions and, being kind of a slave to the market is that, you kind of have to, like, when you have someone paying you for work, you kind of have to follow what they want. But when I'm just doing it for myself or making a book now, I just like, that's part of me, but that's not all of me.
I could go next. So I think my work is I think it can fall into both categories. There are some works that do explicitly address being a Japanese American woman, a Japanese American woman artist, and I do have ideas in incubation that where I am seeking to explore more what it means to be Japanese, Okinawan American, and ancestral lineages, and what we inherit from our cultures, and all of that. But also, I think I do have short stories where, even though it doesn't explicitly say or is it obvious that, oh, this is a Japanese American story, I think I do carry within it themes of being having to navigate between two different worlds, being in liminal spaces and identities, pressures of assimilation, and negotiating personal autonomy versus expectations of family and culture. And I think also, in a broader sense, as a second generation Japanese American, I grew up with first generation Japanese parents. I had earlier exposure to anime and manga before it became more mainstream in American popular culture. And so I think I always also sort of noted the differences, was very aware at a young age of the differences between, I think, Japanese sensibilities in terms of storytelling versus American sensibilities. And so I think I was always conscious of the different modalities. And I think that has also definitely influenced my work. And then I think also, as a marginalized identity, I've always been aware of the fact that many stories are not catered towards me. And then also just feeling that huge revelatory relief when I came across the very few representations in popular culture. Shout out to the last Janum panel I was in, which was about Claudia Kishi from the Babysitters Club, the one Japanese American girl role model I had growing up in the 90s. And so I think being aware of that injustice, it just further fueled my desire to then to show up as a Japanese American woman author, whether or not I was explicitly speaking about my identity, because I think as a reader, I knew how important it was, how life-changing it was to encounter works by writers, authors, creators who were similar to me. And so I think I also was fueled by the desire to give that same relief and gift to other readers in becoming a creator.
Yeah. So obviously my first book was specifically about navigating Japanese American identity, the loss of culture after camp, and sort of rediscovering connections to, Japanese American communities after, being scattered across the country. And sort of Displacement was really a book that was a very personal understanding of where I fit in the Japanese American community, being that I didn't grow up with a lot of that community, the separation that occurs after camp when, my grandmother was, relocated to New York, and then sort of lost the community that she had in San Francisco. And then my mom came back over to the West Coast and, didn't have that existing foundation in Seattle. Even though it existed, she wasn't a part of it. So figuring out what that means in terms of where that puts me was a big part of Displacement, and sort of figuring out the Japanese American identity as distinct from Japanese, because I think navigating that has been a huge part of my whole artistic journey, specifically sort of based, I don't know, Yumi reminded me as a kid, when I was growing up and still wasn't sure what I was. I remember all my, white friends being really into anime, and I consciously rejected all anime and manga for so long, for reasons that don't make a lot of sense. But at the time, I was like, that's not me. And so, I think that really did influence my art in a way that I'm still recovering from, because I missed out on a lot of really good stuff that way. But it's interesting to me that sort of looking back on, tween Kiku who wanted to reject all things Japanese and now sort of trying to cobble it back together. It's kind of interesting to me. But yeah, so that was what my whole first book was about. But like MariNaomi said, like, I don't want that to be every work that I do forever. So it is kind of interesting when that's sort of the thing that publishers are looking for now, is like big explorations of race and identity. And it's like, that can happen in little ways too, in books that are not explicitly about that, because it's an intrinsic part of our art always, and about the journey that got us to what is made, to how we are making that art. And in that way, I also forgot to say something earlier about Miné Okubo's work, but I wanted to point out that one of the things that I really appreciated about Citizen 13660 was the humor in it. And she put like a very sort of wry and dark humor in it that I actually found throughout. Like, one of the processes for my research for displacement was reading through a lot of camp newspapers. And there's so much like dark humor in it. It is amazing. And that is one of the things that, you don't hear about a lot when you're researching about Japanese American incarceration, that sort of monolithic experience that you read about, where it's just like everyone was so good and loyal and they put their heads down and they got through it. But there was a lot of really great, like, just dark humor. And I appreciated seeing that in Mine's work, as something that, people don't associate Asian Americans specifically with being funny, but of course we are.
Yeah, I love it when she would stick her tongue out at the guards and stuff like that. That was adorable.
I think we have a question for you, Kiku, in the chat. Shen asks, given how censored or matter-of-fact Citizen's text was, what was your process for expressing the more internal monologue in Displacement?
Yeah, I thought that the illustrations that Miné did kind of added so much more depth to the captions. The captions, I think you're right, can sometimes seem very sterile and very matter-of-fact, but there's so much depth in the illustrations that she did that adds more to what she is explicitly writing on the page, which is part of what I think allowed the WRA to just to let it happen. I don't think they necessarily analyzed the art as much, or didn't have that visual literacy to understand what was being really conveyed. But yeah, I definitely, it was important for me to get a lot of different sources, and people reflecting, post redress, when there was a lot more sort of emotional honesty, I think, on the part of Issei and Nisei about their experience. A lot of interviews. Shout out to Densho, the organization that really archives a lot of first-person interviews and what's the word? Primary source material about camp. So definitely didn't only use Mine's book, but I do think that there is a lot more depth in the artistic part of the book than in the captions necessarily.
That is, for me, one of the most fun things about being a cartoonist is, you have whatever text. I mean, you want to like really pare down the text as much as possible and show as much as you can in the images. And just when you add like visual puns and stuff, like that's my favorite part of the job.
So our next question, sort of tying into our last, is how you have approached expressing topics of identity, race, sexuality in your artwork, because it is, it doesn't have to be overt. And also, I think, as you were saying, there is this interest now in maybe comics or cartoons that are directly addressing problems of race. But in creating artwork as Japanese Americans, all of your artwork is Japanese American artwork, whether or not it's explicitly addressing those topics or not. And similarly, all of you are creating artwork that falls within queer artists, within women's artists. You know, or there's a breadth of genres that your artwork now falls in.
For me, it depends on the project. When I make comics, I'm usually trying to tell a story of, either a fictional story or a story from my life. Most of the fictional stories are kind of stories from my life. But the identity part, in my preference, should just come out organically. But again, sometimes when you're working with clients, they want to up the identity factor, which is just how things are. And there's definitely been times where I've been working on pieces where I got a question, or I got a request by a client not that long ago saying, how can we make this panel more Japanese American? And my response was, it could not be more Japanese American because I am Japanese American and I'm making this panel. But they were not satisfied with that response. So I threw in some cherry blossoms and we called it a day. But, stuff like that, that's just how it is. If people are confused by, what is Japanese, what is Japanese American, what is American. And I understand the confusion because sometimes, especially growing up, sometimes it was confusing to me. Like, I didn't know what that meant. And I'm, now I'm almost 50 and I'm like, I feel pretty confident and comfortable with who I am. And I don't feel like I need to explain myself anymore to people or justify me being here or who I am. Like, I just am who I am and just deal with it. But that's not really how the world works in a capitalist society. So, I do what the client wants. But when I want to do it, I just tell my experience and let people put the puzzle pieces together instead of hitting them over the head with it. But so it just all depends on the project.
I could go next. Yeah, similar to what Mari says, I think I prefer for it to come out and then from an organic place. I feel like things sort of start to feel heavy-handed when I try to preemptively plant the seeds or the ideas for how I want it to be received by the audience. And so I think it's always an ongoing balancing act, a dance of like, what am I conscious about? What are the things that I want to sort of just let organically happen? And what are things that may come after the fact where I'm not even aware of what I'm creating, but it's not until in hindsight that I'm much more aware of like, oh, these are sort of the themes, ideas, issues of identity that I was grappling with. And I had no idea until it's finished and I'm reading it. That being said, I think I am always on some level aware of the fact that it's, again, still a subversive radical act to be an Asian American femme, queer woman artist who's speaking their truth, no matter what shape or form it takes. And then also, I think because I'm aware of the fact that I'm speaking from an underrepresented identity, then I think it does create more inspiration to contribute to the greater culture in a way that it's filling in gaps that I'm perceiving as opposed to replicating what's already there. And so I think that also is what makes the creating of art and stories fun and exciting for me. The idea that even in the most mundane way, my artwork can push against the barriers and create inspiration for others to do the same in their own big or small ways.
Yeah, I definitely, I think that's a great point that you made. I also, yeah, I think some of the ways in which, being Japanese American, and specifically, I think being Yonsei, and being descendant from the sort of people who were put in camp, has influenced me. I find myself creating a lot of stories about seeking out this sort of sense of belonging and of community. And I think that as an overarching theme in my work is, part of being Japanese American, trying to seek out what was lost, or this sort of greater sense of feeling like you are in a community that is like, I don't know, together and understands each other. And the power of finding that again, even if you didn't think that you belonged there, or even if you didn't think that you earned it or something. I think that is something that it continues to be a theme in my work, whether it's about, whether it's displacement, which is explicitly about, finding your way back into your Japanese American community, or, I work with a lot of sci-fi, and I find things about, connection in different ways very interesting and very compelling. And I think, growing up, specifically being half Japanese and not knowing where you land in that space, and also being a part of Japanese American culture where there's so much scattering and so much distance and so much purposeful distance from community in that way. Finding your way back to a community, or finding your way to a community that you never have been a part of before, but are still willing to do the work to support and be a part of that greater net, I guess. I think that's just always going to be part of my work.
We have a question from the chat for all of you from Kevin. And that's, which Japanese American or Asian American artists, living or past, would you like to see in JANM programs or exhibitions?
Yoko Ono, please.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I thinking about this, there's a lot of obviously really great artists, but I am fascinated by the story of Isamu Noguchi. And I don't know actually if JANM has had an Isamu Noguchi exhibit yet. But his story, I heard I think it was even a 99% Invisible podcast episode about him. And his story is fascinating, specifically as a half Japanese man during World War II, who was not in camp, but he lived in New York at the time, so it didn't matter. And he didn't consider himself threatened. And his goal during World War II was to design a concentration camp that would be more comfortable for people. So he visited a camp in order to sort of imagine how to design it. He wanted to create a promenade and everything. And then he wasn't allowed to leave because he was Japanese. So he was stuck there. And he did not foresee this being a problem. So sort of I don't know, it's a fascinating story to me. And his art is beautiful. He created some famous pieces. He designed a lot of sculpture, as well as urban planning, and park design was one of his passions, but furniture design is sort of what he's most known for. But just that sort of inability to understand your own, the perceived threat that you represent is so fascinating to me.
Oh my God. That's all.
Well, I think my suggestion is this is a little self-serving, but I would love to see a Janum exhibit featuring Japanese American comic book artists, including all three of us. And then there's a lot of really awesome Japanese American indie cartoonists I've encountered over the years, such as Mari Odomo, Chris Mukai. And I think it would just be really awesome to, and then I think the more famous indie, the more prolific indie cartoonist that many of us know of is Adrian Tomine. But I think many of us don't know about like so many other Japanese American cartoonists and graphic novelists. So I think we should have a cute group retrospective, just planting that seed. I think it would be so awesome and people would love it. And I think, selfishly, I would freak out if past me saw like, oh my gosh, an indie comics retrospective of Japanese American cartoonists and have all their books and the bookstore and see all their like original art and panels and sketchbooks. I think that would be really awesome.
I love it. I'll serve. I just want to add that if y'all do decide to do this, I have a database called the Cartoonists of Color where you can just type in, you don't even have to type it in, you just click Japanese and American and it'll just give you a list of a bunch of Japanese American artists.
You three are the perfect people to develop this. I'm so glad. I really hope to be seeing us at Janum in the future. I think that would be amazing. I also hope to see Miné Okubo exhibition number 2 with her post-war work, which is drastically different from her graphic memoir. It's a lot of cats and topless women and abstraction. And she was generous enough to donate so much of it to Janum that has not been seen in a very long time. So these are all exhibitions I'm putting on my wish list. Hopefully we'll see this pretty soon. And that brings me to our final question. I would love to hear what you're working on currently and what your next projects are.
Sure, I'll go. Well, as we talked about a little bit before the event, I'm just finished up a collaborative work with Wing Luke Museum that's based out of Seattle, Asian American History Museum. And it's also about the camps because I was taking on a lot of work at the same time. But after that, my next personal work is much more sci-fi inspired and really about the ways in which tech corporations mediate our relationships. And I find it very interesting, and tying it back to Mine's work, I guess, this is kind of an anecdote. There's an incredible project called the Suitcase Project that was done by a Japanese Canadian artist who I am going to find the name of before I finish this anecdote. But I remember they interviewed a lot of Yonsei, Gosei about if they were taken to camp right now, what they would put in their suitcase, because there was like a rule where you could only take what you could carry. So it was a beautiful project, and they had a exhibit in a museum up in Vancouver. And it featured interviews of people talking about sort of what they would take. And I remember seeing one of the interviews was with a person who worked for Amazon and saying that he would take his laptop and that he would like to still work for Amazon from camp. And I remember thinking, oh my God, the delusion. And it made me really think, and I still think about sort of the ways in which major tech companies have integrated their race into our lives and convinced us that they are on our side. Yeah, so that all sort of ties together. And the suitcase project was done by, I'm so sorry, I'm still finding it. I will put it in the chat. Kayla Isamura.
I'll go next. I am working on, well, I wrote and drew or created a graphic memoir. It's like collage, and it's about a friendship that I had throughout my teens and 20s. And then one day she ghosted me. And so it was me in my 40s trying to figure out what happened between us. And it's sort of kind of like it's kind of a mystery because I was writing it as I was trying to figure it out. And so I finished it a couple years ago, but then it got picked up and it just got announced. It's going to go to print in November through Emerald Press. And so I've been going through each page and changing all the fonts and redrawing everything because I am insane, and that's what we do. But that's what's occupying my time right now. I'm super excited for it to come out. It's probably the weirdest book I've ever done. But I feel like there aren't enough stories about friendships that aren't acrimonious and, fighting over some guy kind of thing. And I don't know, I think it's the best thing I've ever done. But I say that after everything I do, and then I change my mind after the next thing. Anyway, Yumi, you go.
Yeah, I will quickly say, having read a draft of the book Mari was referring to, it's incredible. It's weird. It's such an exciting continuation of the body of work that you've been doing. So I can't wait for other people to read it. As for what I've been working on, I will have a mindful coloring book geared towards, I guess, all ages, adults, kids, people, inner children. I believe it should be coming out this summer. I am working on a re-release of a past illustrated meditation book that should be coming out next year. And I think I also have a few other personal passion projects in incubation. So I and a fellow Japanese American artist, writer, actor, we collaborated on a short film script, and we're sort of in the process of figuring out the logistics of shooting it and producing it. And I do, similar to Kiku, I do also have a sci-fi story that's I've been incubating on forever. And so there's no timeline for when that's going to be finished, but that's sort of cooking in the oven. So whether it's in a few years or in a decade, you will all eventually see it.
Can I just say that I love, after years, decades of white people creating sci-fi, that they think, like, by stealing stuff from Japanese culture and creating like an Orientalist future. It's so great to see actual Asians creating sci-fi.
Yes, definitely. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So infuriating.
And y'all talking about your sci-fi actually made me forget that I actually just finished a sci-fi book that's very, very Japanese American specifically. In it, I designed my dream home, which was like a Japanese inspired Eichler home, but like it's really weird and it keeps changing. Anyway, yes, sci-fi, yay.
Those sound amazing. I'll put them all in my calendar. I can't wait to see the debut of them. Thank you so much for answering the questions, and for anyone in the audience who has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But I think that this next portion of the Zoom call will turn over to our artists and some creative prompts that they've created for you and for this program. MariNaomi, it looks like we have another question for you. that says, from Kevin, who says, I was looking at your Flickr page. Can you tell us more about the sumo wrestling clown balloon series of watercolors? That's a great question.
Oh my God, I haven't updated my Flickr page in like a decade. But yeah, those are pretty old. And I actually think that was the first time I did anything overtly Japanese American, or just specifically Japanese. It started with me because I'm obsessed with sumo wrestling, or I was at some point, and I just thought, wouldn't it be funny to draw a sumo wrestling clown that was vomiting red, white, and blue? And wouldn't that just be the perfect metaphor for my identity? Yes, it was vomiting red, white, and blue balloons while he's fighting with another sumo wrestling clowns. And yeah, it turned into a whole series. I really like them. They're watercolors. I think they're pretty. I'm going to do my prompt now. I wrote it down. I'm going to try not to read it off. I've never done a prompt in my life before, and I was thinking, like, how do I create a prompt inspired by this lovely book? And I was really thinking about the way that the way she writes this book and draws this book. It's a lot like a travel diary, because when I go traveling, I tend to do a lot of journal comics because I'm seeing a lot of new and interesting things, and I just want to record things and have them, just set in my memory. She was obviously recording this for other reasons. I don't think that she necessarily wanted to remember all this, but she was doing it for prosperity. And it made me think about how we tend, like, especially during the pandemic, when a lot of us are stuck in the same place, we can't really go traveling, although some people do. Some of us aren't really able to leave the house because of being immunocompromised or whatever. And we're stuck in these environments that we're really used to, and we don't even notice anymore, probably. But if someone else were to look in, like, they might see a lot of details that we're not used to, or that we just forget. And so the prompt is to sit in your space, and that could be in your home or in some place that you go regularly, like a park, and just record with new eyes what's around you. And that could be by drawing everything around you and just trying to see all the details, not just the new ones, but the ones that you're used to, or it could just be writing it down very descriptively. It could be a fun meditation exercise, but also you can share it with other people and see, or just keep it for yourself and just see, like, what that does for you. So there's my prompt.
Yeah, I also have never done a prompt before, and I, there were so many things that were running through my mind, and then MariNaomi really kind of got a lot of them out there with that prompt. So what I was really thinking of when I was trying to think of this prompt is what Miné was doing that really affected me emotionally in her art. And one of the things that I thought was really important was, especially, crowd scenes, which is kind of the bane of our existence as artists, but nonetheless very important. And what I love about Miné's work is sort of the variety of expressions and emotions that she contains within a crowd. So I'm putting up this low-tech version of people reacting to the food that they're getting in camp. And there's, all these different reactions, all the range of emotions that you feel when you get a cow's tongue from a can. And again, it's like this idea of not having a photograph to reference, not having like these, not to say that it's like less authentic, but in some ways, less authentic version of the past. So my prompt is to either think of a time when you don't have a photograph to remember an event, think of a time that you didn't photograph, and try to draw it in the most emotionally honest way that you can, what you were feeling, what everyone around you assume was feeling, and try to draw, or for an extra level, you can try to think of a moment that you did have a photograph, but don't look at the photograph, and try to draw it from memory, and then compare the emotional expressions on everyone's faces in your drawing versus what was actually photographed, and try to sort of think about why you have interpreted this memory in this specific way, and compare it to what the photograph shows, what people might see when they look at the picture.
I guess I can go next. I love all these prompts, by the way. I think when I was reading Miné Okubo's work, I think what really struck me was just how decades later, what a valuable resource her work is, and how it paints such a vivid picture of a very specific historical event that many of us did not firsthand experience, or were not even alive during the time. And so I think the prompt that I want to offer to all of you is to reflect on your current ongoing pandemic experience. And if you were to be interviewed later, whether by your own direct descendants or just even energetic descendants, whether or not you have biological offspring, but just future generations of your community, what would be sort of instead of painting in broad strokes, what would be the very specific, mundane details and memories that you would want to share? So for example, I feel like because we're collectively in the midst of this pandemic, I think something as mundane as, say, the early phenomenon of stocking up on toilet paper, I think we've all experienced it or known of it, that it seems not significant, but I think for future generations, it would just be like, what? Why were you all stocking up on toilet paper? Or, and so I think just being able to see from a future generation's perspective, what would be very specific memories, incidents, details that comes to mind that you would want to share, that in whatever way made an impression on you, whether it was funny or sad or similar to Miné's work, tragicomic, darkly humorous. What would be some specific incidents and memories that you would want to share to future generations?
Why did people stock up on toilet paper? I never got that.
It's a good question.
I will jump back in again, but thank you to you all for sharing those. We just got a request to put them in the chat, and I tried to record down what you all said, so I'll put those in the chat shortly. But I think at the end of this, I'll give a little bit of time in the Zoom room. I can play a little bit of music, and if folks want to take the time now to really reflect on everything that was said today and all the prompts, you're welcome to do that as well. But I'm going to also ask if there's still any more questions. We're happy. We still have our wonderful artists a few more times, but I just want to thank you all for all that you've shared so far. It's been really illuminating, and I think that even these prompts have really shown how much your work also intersects with Miné Okubo's work. I really appreciate that Rose Keiko mentioned her post-war art, which is a little bit, I guess, weirder or darker than what got published in Citizen 13660, which I think is also important to note was the first narrative of camp written by a survivor that was published, and it was published shortly after the war. And I think that that's often overlooked. So Rose Keiko, not to put you on the spot, but also if you have any other thoughts or anything that has come up for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts as, a curator of the exhibition and also an artist. And then I also I guess kind of as we're reflecting also on these prompts, so I guess this is a two-part question. Mia asks in the chat, like, how do you stay motivated with your work? And as someone with a lot of ongoing projects that are half finished, she's always in awe of artists who finish things. And I think that it's important to note in this moment too that Miné Okubo was remarkably prolific. Camp was always seen with her sketchbook as something that's noted in the exhibition. And in the exhibit, you can also see, you know, the many drafts and all the work that was put into kind of revisiting and revising before coming out with this book. So yeah, I'll throw that to maybe any of you that are interested in answering Mia's question, or if Rose, Keiko, you want to jump in with anything, please feel free to as well.
For some reason, I'm unmuted, so Yumi, you could go.
Okay, great. So before I answer the question, I quickly wanted to share another insight I had while reading Miné Okubo's work, which all of you should do if you haven't already, which I ordered from the Janum bookstore, which you all can do. So I think the other thing that really struck me with Miné Okubo's work is just the reality of how people are still being interned and imprisoned right this moment. And made me think of the immigrants, children in cages, and sort of the ruthless bureaucracy of people carrying out orders and people being reduced to numbers. And it just made me imagine not only the Japanese and Japanese Americans who are interned, but people who are experiencing it right now and what it must be like behind those barbed wire fences and walls and armed security guards, what these people must be going through now, and how in the years to come we will probably be continuing to grapple with the legacy of that as we hear more stories, and just how important it is to hear from people who are directly impacted by systems of oppression and imperialism, white supremacy, xenophobia, how those forces are still very much alive today, and they take on many forms, and how important it is to share those stories. But to go back to the question of how does one finish unfinished works, the question that all of us are constantly facing. I think for me, what has really helped me is external deadlines. So I think before I was, everyone's nodding in recognition. So I think before I became a published author, I think I just really needed to set up external deadlines. So I think when I was self-publishing mini comics and zines, I would apply to a zine fest and not wanting to show up to my table empty-handed. That was my deadline for finishing things. I also used to contribute a weekly comic to the literary magazine, The Rumpus. And so having a weekly deadline really helped. And as I became a published author, having deadlines to fulfill for my editors, that really helped me finish my work. And also with passion projects that don't have such a clear deadline, I think telling people about my work, I think that helps bring excitement back to the motivation to finish it. And also sometimes, every so often I do collaborations. And so I think also having another fellow person who's in it with you, that helps sustain the energy and momentum of the work. And I think also finishing work, it's really a habit. It's a muscle that you exercise. And I think the more you finish things, even if it says something as small as doing a daily drawing every day and posting it on Instagram or your social media channel, I think the momentum of finishing smaller projects helps fuel the momentum to finish larger, more long-scale projects. So wishing you all the best of luck in finishing your projects. And also reminding yourself that, oh, it feels so good to finish something, and just really wanting to feel that relief and gratitude and joy of finishing something and putting it out there. And also for myself, I think it's reminding myself that, oh, I can't just the relational nature of finishing a work. It's not just for you, it's for your readers and for your community. And so I think reminding myself of the excitement of wanting to share the work and seeing people's responses and being able to influence and inspire people in my own way.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to piggyback off of Yumi's comment about, concentration camps that are currently up and running in the United States. I wanted to shout out Tour for Solidarity. If you don't know, they are a Japanese American direct action group that is working to protest and work with legislation and concentration camps in America. And they're incredible. So I put a link in the chat. And yeah, but also what Yumi was saying about, getting things done and having the smaller projects that sort of build into a larger project. One of the things that I think is great about comics is that they are kind of the epitome of done is better than perfect. That's the way it goes. Because what you realize as you spend 2 years making a book that people then tell you they read in an hour, is that people aren't going to be looking at each individual panel and critiquing the art, basically. The comics is a great medium to sort of teach yourself that you don't have to have an illustration be perfect. It really just has to serve its purpose. And remembering that as you are working on it, and remembering that people spend about, 2 seconds on each panel and then move on. It's helpful for me.
I hate deadlines. They are very effective, but I hate them. But yeah, I will never miss a deadline. So yeah, they're very effective. But I don't like being accountable to other people. I like that stuff doesn't work for me personally. Generally, if I've invested a certain amount of time in a comic, and each panel takes a lot of time for me, each page takes a lot of time. So after I've hit a couple hours, if I don't finish it, that's all I'm thinking about is when I'm going to finish it. So I basically, it's like a mental disorder that I have to keep finishing these comics. I wish I could pass along my mental disorder to everybody.
Thanks so much all for sharing, and thank you also. I think I also want to note that I know we gave these prompts, and I'm really appreciative of you all for offering them. I know I said, can you do this? And I do want to give credit to someone that I learn a lot from, Tracy Katakiriyama, who loves to share prompts as well. And that's really where I learned this practice from. But I think I also want to encourage folks that I think that this is relevant even if you don't think of yourself as an artist and you don't think of yourself as someone who can draw well. I think that all of these things are great ways to just reflect on your life in whatever medium feels right to you. Not to co-opt your prompts, but that's something that I always have to think about when I take on these things. Rose Keiko, I just want to give you, is there anything that you wanted to add? I know that you've spent so much time with Miné's work. If there's anything you wanted to bring in before we begin to wrap up.
Sure. Thank you, Joy. It was an incredible experience getting to be an intern at JANM. Curator Kristen Hayashi worked incredibly hard to create this amazing exhibit, and it got runner-up in Hyperallergic's 10 Best LA exhibitions for 2021, which is amazing, and totally worthwhile. I think it should have gotten one of the top 10 spots, but we'll take that up for now. But really, it's incredible to see, especially when you get to work on an artist's singular body of work, especially just from 3 or 4 years, if that, these thousands of sketches and pieces, and to see that sort of chronicling this experience almost seemed like a form of therapeutic processing. It getting to see all of the intermediary stages and then having Kristen to really sort through that work and decide how she was going to show people that experience that Miné had, and that she was willing to do this chronicling both for herself and then also to show it to America, which really at the time didn't have that view. Like you were all saying, there weren't cameras at the beginning, and so it was up to people to figure out how they were going to portray that experience. I think in working with that artwork, it makes me think a lot about the importance of chronicling your own experiences, in taking down your emotions, the emotions of others, in absorbing and feeling, and in creating something with that. And it can be through illustration, it can be through music, through writing, but those experiences can be so valuable and so beautiful. And sometimes it does take creating thousands of sketches to create an end product. And it might not be perfect, it might be censored, or it might be confined by societal issues, but it's so worth it to put time into your creative practice for yourself and for everyone else. And thank you all for being here for today and for speaking with us. You're amazing artists, and I'm so glad that we've had a chance to hear about your process and how you feel about Miné's work. It's just really amazing to see the connections.
Thank you so much for having us and for bringing us all together. It's a huge honor.
Yeah, super fun. I love talking about books. Can I just say one thing? It's been bugging me after reading this book. Like, why does she call the prisoners evacuees? Do you suppose that the WRA had like a bunch of edits for her, like before they published it?
That was actually the language at the time. They were called evacuation camps, and it was partially because the narrative of the WRA, well, even before the WRA was formed, they were saying that they created the camps in order to protect Japanese Americans from white Americans who were going to attack them on site. So
it's such the fact that they wouldn't allow them to drink alcohol, like just something so small as that, like, yeah.
Yeah, the language around incarceration camps has evolved a lot over the last 75, 80 years. Evacuation camps were definitely what they were using at the time. And then internment camps, which actually, it turns out, is the name for like keeping enemy prisoners of war, kind of. Like it's specifically a term used for enemy nationals, which Japanese Americans were not. So that has kind of, I personally do not like the phrase internment camp anymore. Incarceration camp, I prefer now, although technically concentration camps, but because of the pacifying nature of us calling the death camps of Europe concentration camps when they were in fact death camps, just a staggering levels and levels of pacifying, horrifying situations. So, but yeah, it's interesting.
Sorry to derail. It's been bugging me.
No, not a derailing. I think it's really important. And I think that's what's so interesting about this piece is that about A Citizen 13660 is because it is so of its time. It's not a reflection. It's not, it is a reflection, but it's not, we're about to, this is the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066 this year. And so it's not a piece that's being written, now, thinking, though that's incredibly important. We know that, we see that through Kiku's work, which blends that. But I think that it is really, really remarkable that we have this artifact of this time. And I did link there's a wonderful resource on our website about terminology and JANM's history with kind of bringing the language of concentration camps and the different languages and avoiding euphemistic language. So I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think that's always an important conversation to have. with that, I think that we are going to wrap. We're almost at time. But I do want to thank everyone for being here today. I know there are a few questions we didn't get to, but I appreciate your being involved, being part of this. And thank you to Kiku, MariNaomi, Yumi, and of course, Rose Keiko. I think that I'm feeling like I'm just going to leave the call open so we can pull the resources out of the chat. If you want to spend a little bit of time, reflecting on these prompts, I'll play music for like 5 minutes or so until 1:30, and then you're welcome to head out any time that you'd like to. But I guess, are there any last words from folks before I wrap up? But
Y'all are one.
You go, Mari.
No, just everyone's wonderful. I love you all. That's all.
Similarly, just so grateful to share, to be in great company. And it's always such a pleasure to do anything related to JANM. So yay, go support JANM. I love JANM.
Thank you. It actually leads perfectly into my conclusion. Please continue to come to the programs. As we mentioned, we have another program around Miné Okubo. We're going to be able to watch a short film made by another wonderful Japanese American female filmmaker, Yuka Murakami, who's on our staff, and we'll be talking to some experts as well as family members. And then I did mention the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, and we will be part of a group of Los Angeles organizations celebrating or commemorating that anniversary on Day of Remembrance, February 19th. So there are some really exciting opportunities coming up. We hope to see you there. Please support all these artists. The links will be in the chat. And thank you for being a part of this today. This has been a really, as I mentioned at the top, I'm such a fan. This has been a really special program. And I'm really happy that you all were here today. So thanks so much. And I'll play a little music to take us out at the end of this program, but thank you again.